Hello, everyone, and welcome to Novara Live. I'm your host, Dalia Gabriel, and it's Ladies' Night at Novara today because I am joined by our co-host, Helena, aka No Justice MTG. Helena, how are you doing today?
Doing very, very well. Good to be here for the second night in a row, making up for my absences for the last couple of weeks or so, and now back in my familiar purple environment as well.
The creature comforts is what we're all holding on to in these dark times. So coming up tonight, we've got an amazing interview with actor Khaled Abdallah on why he and other film and TV professionals have condemned the BBC's decision to pull its documentary on life in Gaza. We also talk about Cambridge University, who is trying to block pro-Palestine protests, and the Tate brothers have returned to the US. So stay tuned for all of that. As ever, please make sure to let us know your comments, or you can tweet us on the hashtag Novara Live. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer is in Washington to meet with US President Donald Trump for their first White House talks. The real business didn't begin until after we went on air, when Trump and Starmer met for a chat in front of reporters. But before that, Starmer was welcomed to Washington with a reception at the British Embassy. Accompanied by new British ambassador to the US, Peter Mandelson, Starmer rubbed shoulders with the who's who of the Washington political elite, including senior politicians, business leaders, government officials, and the super wealthy. Addressing the glitzy embassy crowd, Starmer decided to stick to his strengths that we all know and love him for, his sense of humour. He kicked things off with a joke.
Already I can feel there's a real buzz around Washington right now. You can sense that there's a new leader in town, that he's a true one-off, a pioneer in business and in politics. Many people love him. Others love to hate him. But to us, he's just Peter. Peter is the right person to help us work with President Trump and to take this special relationship from strength to strength.
Oh, how hilarious. Look, if you feel like you live in a different world to the people who found that joke funny, it's because you do. Now, Starmer never quite explained why Peter Mandelson is so well equipped to help the UK deal with Donald Trump. Maybe it's their common pal, Jeffrey Epstein, who introduced them. At the embassy, Starmer also spent a moment laying the ground before his audience with the US president by reminding him of the special relationship.
We share fundamental values of openness, of democracy, freedom of speech, freedom to thrive, and freedom to pursue the future. So we want to strike a new partnership. We share the view that our best days lie ahead. And, taking out a chainsaw isn't quite my style. But we are stripping away red tape and bureaucracy. We are reforming permitting, getting things built, reducing barriers to investment and growth. And we're open for business, open for investment. And we're determined to help US innovators thrive in the United Kingdom.
Things kicked off today with a joint press conference between Starmer and Trump in the White House. But before Starmer arrived, some thought the signs weren't very good. Sky's Mark Stone posted this online. It seems that the Union flag is flying upside down outside Blair House, the presidential guest house opposite the White House where PM Starmer is staying for his visit. It's a little bit embarrassing. Now, some of the topics to be discussed in these talks were briefed in advance. Trump's officials told the press that trade would be a big component of the discussion. That follows an announcement that Trump made last night promising 25% tariffs would be placed on EU goods soon. That's a fate Starmer will want to avoid for UK trade. But in that same Oval Office press conference last night, Trump also said this. The European Union was formed to screw the United States. That's the purpose of it, and they've done a good job of it. But now I'm president. It's funny how the country that is overwhelmingly the largest financial, militaristic, and political power in the world has managed to create an inferiority complex for itself where literally every structural power is against it and is set out to screw it over. It's like, but you run everything. So how could that have actually happened? Anyway, Another big subject likely to be on the table is security. The White House has already responded to Starmer's pledge to hike UK defence spending to 2.5% of GDP, saying it was, quote, very pleased. Also under discussion will be Ukraine. Keir Starmer has pledged British troops on the ground in Ukraine should a ceasefire be reached, where they'll serve as peacekeepers. But Starmer will also want the US to provide security guarantees for Ukraine should they reach a truce with Russia. That is something Trump has been reluctant to give. Earlier this week, Foreign Secretary David Lammy also suggested that Starmer would be there to ask Trump for permission when it comes to our own foreign policy. What else is new? Here's Lammy discussing the UK's decision to return the Chagos Islands to Mauritius with Robert Peston.
On a military level and an intelligence level, we're very intertwined with the United States. We struck a deal. After striking that deal, there was a change of government in Mauritius, and the new government in Mauritius had to have time to look at the deal. And there has been a change of government here in the United States, and the United States administration have had time to look at the deal. I still believe it's the best deal.
But does President Trump have a veto?
Well, if President Trump doesn't like the deal will not go forward. And the reason for that is because we have a shared military and intelligence interest with the United States. And of course, they've got to be happy with the deal, or there is no deal.
We're going to try and bring you some footage of the meeting between Trump and Starmer soon. But for now, Helena, do you think that Trump is convinced?
I mean, the broad platform on which the original special relationship was founded, I'm not sure whether he's entirely bought in. He's never really been someone who's been bought into historical precedent anyway. He likes to forge his own path because, again, most things are about Trump's ego at the end of the day. But the unique nature of the special relationship definitely does suit Trump down to a T. And the basis of that relationship is that America says jump and the UK says how high. That is the basis of the relationship, the special relationship, is that America what it wants. We saw this in the 2000s when Blair essentially did exactly what the United States and George Bush wanted by going to war with Iraq. And the foreign policy being entirely directed by Washington, by the White House and the State Department. That directed our foreign policy ever since. The fact that David Lammy is going over there for permission to have a look at what our foreign policy should or shouldn't be from the Trump administration shows you that dynamic hasn't changed. And that dynamic is perfectly suited to Donald Trump. He's king in the castle, right? He gets to do whatever he's pictured himself. He put pictures on social media of himself in the White House as king. And what's better than being king of just America, being king of the other countries as well, by being able to be Caesar Trump and having your thumb point whichever way that you want it to. And then other world leaders have to therefore follow your whims because you're the person with all of the power. So the nature of that special relationship and the way that in which it gives Trump the ability to do what he wants and have other people do his bidding, that is something that I think he can definitely get on board with. But this is more self-serving to his own personal interests rather than kind of like the history of American imperialism, for example. Not that I don't think he's also kind of bought in on that too, but I don't think his thinking goes that far. Certainly the people behind him, the people in charge of Jar Jar Binks, those are the ones who really do understand that relationship. Not that he certainly does, but it's very easy to push him in that direction when, again, his ego is what's important. When it comes to Starmer and Lammy, though, what's interesting about them is that do they or do they not agree with what he says? I don't really know. Starmer's a bit of a chameleon in that regard. He doesn't really have any true beliefs. He just does what he's told. But it's interesting that in the very short term, what they want is to get economic concessions, right? Trade agreements, trade rules, and missing out on the tariffs that the EU are potentially getting from the Trump administration. That is something that they absolutely do want to do. And a lot of that will involve glazing Donald Trump, right? A lot of that will involve sucking up to him, doing what he wants, doing what his administration wants to be able to extract some kind of concession in terms of an economic arrangement that is beneficial to the UK, right? But how far does that dynamic go? How far do we go down the road of, well, America gets what it wants as long as we become tariff-free, right? Where do you put your foot down? And how far does that go then that it makes our standing with the rest of the world worse, even though we are the ones who are the the only ones who are actually getting away with missing out on Trump's kind of more hawkish policy elsewhere. This is not a long-term strategy that is going to be successful if the UK wants to be the superpower that a lot of the kind of imperial nostalgists want it to be. All you end up is being a vassal state of the United States, right? I am no European Union superfan. I was skeptical of them. I voted Remain in the referendum, and I think we were better off within it than without it. But at the very least, when you got with the EU, you had some kind of equal partnership with a group of states who were trying to form some kind of economic bloc that could somehow countenance what was happening in China and the United States and BRICS and places like that. Outside of the European Union now, we are literally just a vassal state. We have nothing. And it's very interesting to see Trump go, well, the EU was set up as a way to try and stick it to the United States. I'm like, well, yeah, there's got to be economic power somewhere, and small states have to get together to be able to do that. This is what BRICS is, in the way in which the global south have gotten together to try and oppose the Anglosphere Western alliance that's formed around US imperial and economic foreign policy for since the Second World War, essentially, since that paradigm, since that zeitgeist was initially created. So it's not unreasonable for these people to want to extract themselves away from the US, essentially allowing it to do what it wants. So much for getting rid of sticking plaster politics, as Keir Starmer likes to call it, because that's all he's getting, right? He is selling out the future choices our government and our country could have to make it more prosperous for us on our terms, to get short-term concessions to save his failing government, right? I know it's only been 8 months or whatever, but that's basically what we're seeing, is a failed administration already, with not even the year into them being elected, right? And, it may suit them down to the ground to get favorable coverage in the media because getting a good deal with Trump, or allowing American corporations to come in. The Competition and Markets Authority has been instructed now that it's going to not get involved with much global mergers that we see, which is going to entrench corporate power further. We've seen their alliances with BlackRock and the oligarch administration in the USA. They're going to love that stuff. It's growth, of course, but growth for whom? And for what interest? And is it really going to serve the British people in the long term? That's the problem that Starmer and Lammy are going to have. And that can only be the position they take for the next 4 years, because that's how long Trump has got.
Yeah, absolutely. I think two things sort of strike me there. The question of sovereignty, first of all. A lot of the Leave EU campaign, the Brexit campaign, was centered around this imagination that the EU's bureaucracy, that the EU is hamstringing the UK's ability to have sovereignty. Now, like you, Helena, I'm not an EU superfan, but I don't think that the reason that people in Britain don't feel like their will around the economy and politics is being realised is because of the EU. I think it's because of neoliberalism. But there is this sense of, at least within the EU, there was a sense that we were on a kind of equal footing, as it was, with negotiating partners within the EU, that there was a sense that, there was some kind of leverage that Britain had within the EU when it comes to other powers within the EU. Whereas leaving the EU has basically meant that we're incredibly vulnerable to the winds of the US, to the whims of the US, to the US for our economy, etc. And that basically, and we have very, very little leveraging power in that context, because, and this comes on to my second point, which is that I think Trump, it's very interesting because I think the calculation that Trump has made is that the EU and Britain, to him, are irrelevant entities on the global stage right now. And, some of that, it's partly because Europe makes very little, although it does still make things that are really important to the US economy, car manufacturing, etc. But he's made the calculation that Europe doesn't offer enough in terms of its exports, in terms of its consumer markets, and in terms of its role in military strategy to really justify Trump paying it much attention. Trump's outlook now is generally isolationism and trying to ally with Russia against China. He is looking at where are the big, powerful poles within the global economy and political landscape. And he has made the calculation that the EU and Britain as well are not active players. So it begs the question of where is all of this, bootlicking from Starmer and David Lammy going to bring us? But also what is so chilling in that was one thing that Keir Starmer said was he was like, we don't necessarily have the same approach or it's not my style to bring a chainsaw out onto the global stage. But, we are doing essentially he tried to say, we are doing all of the things that Trump is doing. We're trying to roll back on state protections. We're trying to create a pro-business economy, which is another word for a pro-rich economy. And so sitting here in Britain, you're thinking, so what was the point in me electing a Labour government? What was the point of electing a Labour government if they're going to proudly say that they're everything that the US Republicans are, except apart from in style? That's not what a Labour government or a Labour Party should be. Now, I understand that there are certain diplomatic relationships that you have to maintain, and maybe you can't come out all guns blazing. But you don't have to go so far as to say I'm basically the same as Trump's Republican Party in terms of what I want to achieve for the country. The only difference is that I'm a little bit less crass. I mean, that's the accusation. That's the thing about Keir Starmer that makes him so unpopular, is the sense of this man doesn't have any fixed principles. We don't know what he stands for. And he's just proved that right by trying to align himself politically with Republicans when no one asked him to do that. We just asked you to do, your normal diplomatic affairs. Doesn't require this level of bootlicking and trying to make out like you are basically the UK version of the Republican Party. Anyway, very bizarre. Over 800 film and TV professionals, including stars like Gary Lineker, Miriam Margolyes, and Riz Ahmed, have signed a letter urging the BBC to reinstate its film documenting the life of children and young people in Gaza. The film, Gaza, How to Survive a War Zone, was pulled after it emerged that the central narrator was the 14-year-old son of a deputy agricultural minister in the territory's government, which of course is run by Hamas's political wing. The letter, addressed to the Director General of the BBC, Tim Davie, condemned the move as an act of censorship. The letter states this: "This film is an essential piece of journalism offering an all-too-rare perspective on the lived experiences of Palestinian children living in unimaginable circumstances, which amplifies voices so often silenced. It deserves recognition, not politically motivated censorship. Beneath this political football are children who are in the most dire circumstances of their young lives. This is what must remain at the heart of this discussion. As programme makers, we are extremely alarmed by the intervention of partisan political actors on this issue and what this means for the future of broadcasting in this country. Calls to remove the documentary from iPlayer and social media set a dangerous precedent. As media professionals, we are extremely alarmed by the intervention of political actors, including foreign diplomats, and what this means for the future of broadcasting in this country." Now, it is true that the documentary was pulled not because it was found to be saying anything untrue or misleading. Rather, it was pulled because of a backlash surrounding a family member of one of the child presenters. So essentially a personal attack, an ad hominem attack, rather than anything to do with the actual content of the film. Now, the open letter addressed this, stating, "Capitulating to such attempts to block the film's reinstatement to iPlayer would signal that Palestinian children's stories are only valid if their families pass arbitrary purity tests." It also argued that the BBC's decision reflected a double standard in which Palestinians are not given the ability to speak openly and honestly about their own conditions. Silencing a child's first-hand account of survival in Gaza, where over 13,000 children have been killed since October 2023, is not about compliance, but about erasing Palestinian suffering. The BBC must resist political pressure aimed at suppressing narratives that humanize Palestinians. Now, that is a really important point that the letter made and raises the question about whether opponents of the film are interested in any stories making it out from Palestinians in Gaza, period. Take a look at this interview between Nick Ferrari and journalist and author Rachel Shabby.
If we stay with this film, though, the Director General says it shouldn't be transmitted. The board says it shouldn't be transmitted. But shouldn't we have been told that the narrator was the son of someone who works for Hamas? How can you defend putting representatives of, or children of representatives of Hamas on a documentary? Hamas is a proscribed organisation. I ask again, how can you put this film out if you have the imprimatur of the BBC and allow this to have been made in this fashion without any editorial checks.
Have you seen this film, Nick?
I've only seen excerpts of it, and I don't intend to watch it all either, no.
So Nick Ferrari is rallying against the documentary that he not only hasn't watched, but has no intention of ever watching. Had Nick Ferrari actually watched the film, he would have learned about all the ways in which the 4 children who host the documentary are currently surviving a genocide being leveled against their people. He would have learned about 10-year-old Renad, who, after her school was shut down, started a TikTok cookery channel where she prepares meals on a camping stove against the backdrop of falling bombs. He would have learned about 11-year-old Zakaria, who, after being separated from his parents, now lives at Al-Aqsa Hospital, where he volunteers with the ambulance crews. And he would have also learned about Rana, a young pregnant mother trying to survive being displaced in a war zone. But Nick Ferrari, it seems, isn't interested in those stories. Instead, he wants to discredit the entire film because one of the children in it has a father who works in the Gaza government, which, yes, is run by Hamas because that is the Strip's only governing structure. And it begs the question, would he have the same problems if a similar documentary about Israeli children, say, included the child of an IDF soldier serving in an army currently under investigation by the ICC for genocide? To talk more about the letter, I spoke earlier to Khaled Abdallah, one of the signatories of the letter. He's an acclaimed actor who you may know from his roles in The Crown, as well as in films like United 98, The Green Zone, and The Kite Runner. I began by asking him what he thinks will happen if the BBC uphold their decision to remove the documentary.
If you zoom out, 13,000 is the lowest estimate of children that have been killed. A genocide is taking place. And a documentary has been made about children, in which the main focus is children's experience of war in Gaza. And in that context, the BBC has decided to take this documentary down and been unable to somehow defend the original commissioning decision. The reason given is because Abdallah, who narrates the documentary, but is clearly not in any way the author of the documentary, his father is a deputy agricultural minister in Gaza. And we're in a world in which, literally, last night, Donald Trump posted an AI-generated video of him lying by a swimming pool next to Netanyahu, sipping cocktails, while Elon Musk has dollars flying from the sky, and the rubble of Gaza is turned into a Riviera. And there is no outcry. We have an outcry because a 13-year-old boy who has somehow survived a genocide, his voice has been used to narrate a documentary. And yet, alongside everything else, we have tame responses from the BBC in relation to Donald Trump's calls for ethnic cleansing, or those kind of crazy scenes that we all saw by the fireside in the White House with him and Netanyahu. A tameness in relation to all of that. So for me, it's kind of, you kind of want to look at the world and say, just like, wake up. Did this letter that complained to the BBC about the documentary mention those 13,000 children? Did it mention that there was a genocide? Was it concerned about the displacement of almost the entirety of the population of Gaza? Is it concerned about the children who are being killed week after week after week? So for me, it's deeply sad that an institution that, frankly, I care about, right? I care that we have a BBC, And I want our BBC to be doing what it should be doing. And it's deeply sad that things have eroded to such an extent that even under these circumstances, it's unable to stand up for what is clearly the case. So yeah, that's the basics of how I feel about it.
Yeah, and I think that question about what feels like the erosion of the BBC in this context is so important. I mean, what precedent are you concerned could be set if the BBC does uphold their decision to remove this documentary? What does it mean for Palestinian voices in the media and for the BBC's approach to the Palestine issue in general?
It acts as another form of silencing. And I think, frankly, that's what's essentially behind this at some deep level, right? Because you might guess that the next time something that is going to be done about children in Gaza or about Palestine, you know, that there will be more red tape and more bureaucracy and more, you know, around the idea of it because it's such a hot button issue, right? And so it has long-term silencing, chilling effects. It shifts the Overton window, right? Or it narrows the Overton window kind of hugely over what we can talk about. And you know, this is sure, let them do an investigation into how this happened. But frankly, the deep investigation that should be being carried out, as far as I'm concerned, and I'm sure the day will come, right, is how our entire media establishment has been so ineffective and so silent in the context of a genocide taking place. My entire childhood and adulthood and education was entirely centered correctly around the words never again. And then the time comes when this is happening and our media establishment prides itself on the apparent both sidesism, right, of a debate and washes its hands. To me, that's what we should really be talking about here. A genocide has happened on the media establishment's watch. It is still happening, right? The ethnic cleansing of Gaza might be about to happen on the media establishment's watch. And we're talking about a 13-year-old boy who, by the way, has the right to be a 13-year-old boy. And, you know, they call him a senior Hamas official. He is the deputy agricultural minister who has been, as far as I understand, working on agricultural things. He's not accused of killing anybody. Whereas Netanyahu is accused of being a war criminal and is being invited to sit in the White House, in front of the fire and gloat while Donald Trump talks about ethnic cleansing Gaza.
The bizarre exceptionalism that you talk about, you know, whenever reports or instances where Palestinians are producing films or documentaries or art or even just media reports of their conditions, it's subject to this incredible, unique amount of scrutiny and so-called editorial standards. What is it about the Palestinian issue that provokes this level of threat within the establishment?
I mean, frankly, we Arabs are looked at as if the secret that we hide is that we are racist and that we are anti-Semitic. And that is a deeply racist gaze towards us, right? That we are not to be trusted, that our humanity somehow has to be double proved and triple checked and given all the, you know, and our experience is somehow not valid, right? Unless it is given, I don't know, some kind of like ridiculous sort of standard of approval that is not ours. I mean, and that's just a deeply racist assumption. Regardless of the political aspects of this, right? This is a deeply humanitarian issue. And this is about a rules-based, rights-based order that is being destroyed with huge consequences for every other cause that matters. whether it's Ukraine or whether it's Sudan or whether it's any humanitarian issue around the world, right? International law is being destroyed. And that's why you had Daniel Levy just a couple of days ago, going out and talking about the huge danger that is being created by this, this total impunity in the face of such extraordinary abuse of international law and killing of civilians. Even if you don't accept that it's a genocide, you know that at least 13,000 children have been killed, right? And the reason that it's important to focus on children in that regard is because there is no question as to whether or not they are civilians, right? Let's assume that every single other person was not a civilian, right? 13,000 children. What does that point to?
And it speaks to that kind of threshold of innocence that Palestinians have to reach in order to be heard. And even then, they will find a way to sort of discredit that voice. I mean, looking at the backlash against the documentary as well. I mean, earlier we showed a clip of Nick Ferrari. You might have seen it. He's one of the people who was really advocating for the BBC to uphold its decision to remove the documentary. And he basically said that even though he's making all these claims about the documentary, he hasn't even watched it and he never intends to. What does that tell us about the people that are calling for this documentary to be taken down?
It tells me that they're credulous on the one side, right? They hear the headline and therefore they immediately believe what's being said about this documentary rather than being able to watch it for themselves. And with that then comes the assumption of how easy it is to discredit any Palestinian or Arab or, so-called pro-Palestinian voice. There is nothing in the letters, right, that as far as I have seen, talks about anything substantive in terms of what actually takes place in the documentary. And so it ends up reading as if the main aim is basically to prevent this kind of thing from being commissioned. The truth is we need more of these things to be done. The truth is that it's a miracle that anything was made of this, anything was made under the extreme circumstances that people are surviving through in Gaza. And frankly, from my perspective, when you watch it, the documentary is at pains to be balanced, right, in terms of how it presents the details, to anticipate criticisms or things that were said about particular events. And clearly they made an assumption that they were working with a child, right? In terms of this narration, right? That the humanity of a child and the voice of a child under this context is so degraded. To me, it's kind of equivalent to what are you supposed to? Half of the establishment in this country are at some level. A lot of them are the descendants of slave owners, right? Or the descendants of Vichy France, or the descendants of fascist Italy. Do we completely discredit them as being the children of whatever their parents did? It's absurd, And somehow that's the kind of weird criticism that's kind of, leveled at this side. That what is Nick Ferrari or other people, what have they been watching? Of the, for me, some of the most painful videos that I've watched in the context of Gaza have not been the most violent of the videos, right? They have been of children waking up in hospital beds, looking up, whose families have been entirely obliterated, looking up, recognizing no one. That is the reality that they should be talking about day in, day out. This morning, Nick Ferrari should have been talking about Donald Trump's video that he tweeted on his, that he tweeted to the world as President of the United States, not a 13-year-old boy in Gaza.
That was actor Khalid Abdullah speaking to me earlier today. And if you want to hear more of what Khalid had to say, we'll be uploading a longer version of that interview later tonight. But for now, we're going to take a look at another aspect of this story. The crackdown on free speech about Palestine is not just happening in the media. The University of Cambridge has applied for a 5-year injunction which would restrict pro-Palestine protests on its main grounds. The injunction means that it will be illegal for any student to engage in any form of protest, quote, for a purpose connected with the Palestine-Israel conflict at its Senate House, Greenwich House, and Old Schools sites. As was the case in many UK universities last year, Cambridge students held an encampment in front of one of its colleges for several months to protest Israel's war on Gaza. In some cases, this led to graduation ceremonies having to be relocated. The university gave the following explanation for seeking the injunction against further protests of a similar nature. The application is necessary to protect the university's staff and students, its property, the interests of its research and funding partners, and the interests of the wider university community from irreparable harm, which would be suffered if these protests were to continue unrestrained and or if further encampments were to be established on the land. The university stated that previous encampments cost £230,000 in additional cleaning, security and legal costs, and that there is a, quote, intangible, non-monetary harm suffered by graduands and their families if the graduations do not take place in Senate House. So basically, the emotional damages there of having your graduation ceremony held in one hall rather than the original hall that it was scheduled in, I guess. The university also claimed to have, quote, serious concerns that confidential information was accessed when students were occupying Greenwich House, one of the university's administrative buildings, although it has provided no evidence to support that claim. The move also comes shortly after an investigation by Liberty Investigates, which found evidence of a lobbying campaign by campus security officials urging universities across the UK to adopt a more heavy-handed US-style approach to policing student encampments. So far, up to 113 students and staff in the UK have faced disciplinary investigations linked to pro-Palestine protests across 28 universities since 7th of October 2023. Now, the decision to seek an anti-protest injunction has sparked intense backlash from staff and students who accuse the university of engaging in an all-out attack on freedom of expression and assembly. An open letter signed by over 170 University of Cambridge staff said the following. Under the terms of the injunction as drafted by your administrators, the presence of even a small gathering outside the Old Schools or Senate House in order to hand in a petition might be considered in breach of the court order if it slowed down access to the land in question. If a graduating student decided to hold up a Palestinian flag or revealed a placard during a degree congregation, they could be sent to jail or face the seizure of their assets. This kind of authoritarian reflex has no place in the governance of a university, which by its nature must be a space where dissenting opinions can be expressed without fear of heavy-handed repression. The freedom to question the decisions of the powerful and challenge injustice is an essential component of academic freedom. Without it, the congregations you claim to be protecting from disruption and trespassers risk becoming a meaningless charade. Earlier today, I spoke to Professor Priyamvada Gopal, one of the signatories of that letter, and I began by asking her why she thinks Cambridge has decided to take this action now.
The formal reason for this is that there is a graduation ceremony on the 1st of March, that is day after tomorrow, and in their claim, they have suggested that they're afraid of disruption. There is no evidence that there will be any disruption. But that is the kind of formal trigger for doing it at this moment. It should be said, though, that they have done graduation ceremonies in the past. They've moved them from outdoors to indoors. They have plenty of spaces where they can do this. And it's a little bit unclear why they have decided all of a sudden that they cannot actually move the location for graduation ceremonies and that the one on the 1st of March has to be protected.
this decision comes after we know there's been some quite intense lobbying to get UK universities to respond to these Palestine encampments in a similar way to the US. So I guess, would you say that there's a good chance that Cambridge's heavy-handed response, which, as you said, it's the formal reason is for this graduation ceremony, but the actual injunction is for 5 years. Do you see a connection between those lobbying efforts and the decision that Cambridge is making to try for this injunction?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I actually spent last year in the United States. I was based at an institution in the town of Princeton, which also has Princeton University. And I saw firsthand the very, very heavy-handed repression enacted by universities in the US. And it seems to me very clear that Cambridge's action is on the lines of what we saw enacted in the US. Now, I can't say with any certainty that there have been lobbying efforts on this side of the pond. It would be very astonishing if there hadn't been such efforts. We've seen lobbying of politicians. We've seen lobbying affecting media organizations like the BBC. So it seems extremely unlikely that there isn't lobbying efforts being directed to UK universities. But I am very concerned, and one of the reasons I'm particularly concerned about Cambridge's astonishingly heavy-handed and preemptive response to protests that have not even yet taken place is that they seem like a real precursor to the kind of heavy-handedness and criminalizing of protests that we have seen in the United States, which are still ongoing and which have had extremely harmful consequences, both for students and for many of their teachers.
And so what precedents, if Cambridge is successful in seeking and implementing this injunction, what precedents are you concerned that this could have, not just for student protests, but broader free speech around Palestine as a whole?
Well, it's extremely consequential that in seeking this injunction, Cambridge is violating two articles of the Human Rights Convention. One is, of course, freedom of assembly, and the other one is freedom of expression. But it should also be said that in an academic context, there is something particularly egregious about seeking to shut down not just protest, but protest on a specific topic. I mean, I think that's where things get extremely dodgy, because you're not just saying, okay, here are these spaces where we don't want people to assemble, or here are these spaces where you cannot hold a protest. It is very specifically singling out the Israel-Palestine conflict as the topic which cannot be protested. Now, this is, I would say, it's unprecedented. Because in the past, injunctions, first of all, had been only sought for a 6-month or a shorter period. They have been asked for around specific events that have been taking place. But here is one of the premier institutions, higher education institutions in the United Kingdom of kind of world-leading status, essentially saying, you may or may not protest other issues in these spaces, but whether you're an individual, persons unknown, or whether you are a student group, whether you're a group or a person, you may not speak or protest Israel, Palestine, and related topics in these 3 deemed spaces. And it's very important to understand, Delia, that the spaces being alluded to, that is the Senate House lawns and the old schools, these are 2 of the 3 spaces they want the injunction to apply to, are basically the equivalent of the university's central green. It's the central courtyard. It is the only thing that Cambridge University has that is akin to a commons, that isn't owned by one of the smaller colleges, one of the colleges. It's not a small institution. This is the very center of town. It is the very center of the university, and it is where we do congregate for events like graduations. So it seems extraordinary that you would say that in the heart of Cambridge University, which also happens to be the heart of Cambridge town, not only can you not protest on land owned by the university, you also cannot protest on the street in front of this land, which in fact does not belong to the university, which is in fact public land. So you can see that quite apart from specifying the topic that cannot be protested, you're also trying to determine what cannot be done on public land. And that has, I think, real ramifications for future protests, whether those are universities or whether they are around other institutions.
Yeah, that's such an important point. And I hadn't thought about the importance of putting these restrictions on public land or the commons, as you've mentioned. I mean, I want to also go back to the point that you made about the specificity of this injunction, not just around protests in general, which previous injunctions that universities have sought have been generally around occupation. This has been around the specific question of Palestine. We are also seeing other kinds of crackdowns. For example, City University of New York, CUNY, cancelling a job ad for a Palestine studies position. I mean, you've been in the academy for a while now. This isn't the first time that Palestinian scholarship has been cracked down on. Edward Said's offices were firebombed, decades ago. Do you think that what we're seeing now is an escalation, or is it kind of a continuation of the kinds of crackdowns on Palestinian scholarship and activism that we have been seeing for decades now?
It has never been simple to do Palestine scholarship. It has never been simple to speak out on Palestine. But to be honest, I cannot imagine Edward Said being allowed to give the Reith lectures on the BBC as he was in the early 90s. So, difficulties notwithstanding, it was still possible for a small number of people to be heard on the question of Palestine. It was still possible to conduct scholarship, such as Professor Rashid Khalidi at Columbia. But now you look at Columbia and you see the extraordinary heavy-handedness with which that university has cracked down both on students and staff. We have Professor Catherine Franke, who had to leave her job and take essentially early retirement for the fact of having spoken up for protesting students after having been smeared and lobbied against. I think what we are seeing is an unprecedented scale. In the past, there's a small number of individuals might have been smeared, might have been attacked in the press, might have been, in Edward Said's case, firebombed. We should also remember that Edward Said was denied an honorary fellowship at King's College, Cambridge, but that was a college level, relatively small matter that had to do with an internal fight. But now you're seeing repression on Palestine, whether it is, individual lectures or events, or whether it is actual jobs, as we have seen that in the case of CUNY, where there is sustained, wide-ranging, global, targeted shutting down of discussion. And this, to my mind, is both unprecedented, but also has to be connected with the other attacks on universities and on academics and on the wider question of intellectual work on areas around race and colonialism. I believe in the case of the job at CUNY, one of the claims that is being made, sort of laughably, is that settler colonialism is a problematic paradigm. I mean, this is a paradigm that's been around for a long time. It's been substantiated in scholarship, but all of a sudden we are supposed to believe that it is a dodgy and contested paradigm and should not be part of an academic job description. So I think we are seeing, yes, continuation of past attacks, but we are also seeing a scale and a system, what is the word I'm looking for? A systematicity, if you like, and a kind of relentlessness in attacks that I think spells it has very bad implications, not just for Israel-Palestine discussions, but for academia more generally.
What do you think it is about Palestine scholarship that appears to be so uniquely threatening that a university would take a 5-year injunction just to prevent, a particular kind of conversation or activism around this topic happening?
Look, let's be blunt. The only thing that Palestine has going for its cause is knowledge, is truth, is an understanding of history, is a sense of the facts on the ground. These are very powerful weapons for a people who have been stripped of everything else. They have no economy, they have very little land, they have no army, no standing army, they have no means to protect themselves. They have very few modern powers in their corner. What do they have going for them? They have the fact that people who think about ideas and who study history know that they are a dispossessed people against whom enormous injustice has been inflicted. So this is their only weapon. And that weapon clearly is threatening to institutions and to an establishment in the West, but not only in the West, that is really determined to see them effectively eliminated as a people. And so, if these things didn't matter, right? If truth and knowledge and history and facts didn't matter, you could just let a bunch of academics, sit in a corner and talk into the night in their kind of silly little seminars. But actually, these are not silly little seminars. These are the weapons that the Palestinian cause, the only weapons really that the Palestinian cause has. And you can see why those who are determined to eliminate, marginalize, and vanquish Palestine as a cause and Palestinians as a people are going to want that weapon removed and put away from public sight as soon as possible.
That was Priyamvada Gopal speaking to me earlier today. I must say I am really struck by the fact that at a time when the moral panic in our press around, free speech on campus, free speech at universities being attacked by trans students and students of color and all these people who have all this power to dictate what debates and what speech can happen on and off campus, that at that time, at the same time as that moral panic is happening, we're seeing some of the most regressive crackdowns on freedom of speech and freedom of research in this case. I mean, I was very struck by the fact that Priya said there that within her career, she hasn't seen something quite as draconian and quite as explicit as we are seeing, like this injunction. And it just goes to show you that a lot of this moral panic around free speech on campus is not actually about freedom of expression and a genuine commitment to a neutral principle of freedom of research and freedom of speech, but was rather about trying to exercise a backlash against against the ability of marginalized students to organize and campaign. Because when it actually comes to the university, which has power, exercising that power to restrict the parameters of protest and debate, we are not hearing, we're not hearing concerns from the normal, the expected actors around free speech on campus. It's freedom of speech for everyone but Palestinians, freedom of speech on everything but Palestine. So just further evidence for what many of us had an instinct for, had a gut instinct was the case anyway. Now, on to our next and final story. Online misogynist Andrew Tate has escaped Romania, where he continues to face human trafficking and sexual exploitation charges. Tate, along with his brother Tristan, pictured here, and who also faces charges in Romania, boarded a private jet bound for the US early on Thursday morning. The Tates, who have both US and British citizenship, have now arrived in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, where Andrew Tate spoke to reporters.
We've yet to be convicted of any crime in our lives ever. We have no criminal record anywhere on the planet ever. Our case was dismissed on the 19th of December in Romania under the Biden administration. And our prosecutor recently decided, because we have no active indictment in court, to let us go and return. This is a democratic society. It's supposed to be innocent until proven guilty, as my brother and I are. And I think it's extremely important that we stop allowing media spin, wrap-up smears, lies, or carefully constructed narratives from George Soros-funded operations trying to destroy the reputations of good people who have no intention to do anything other than follow the law.
Now, Tate is just not correct there. His case in Romania was not dismissed. What happened was that a preliminary court in Bucharest ruled that the human trafficking case against the Tates could go to court. But then in December, an appeals court ruled that the case did not yet meet the requirements for a trial, sending it back to prosecutors. So that investigation is still ongoing and no charges have been dropped. Now, both Tate brothers remain under judicial control by the Romanian authorities, which makes their sudden departure somewhat surprising. Romania has said that no charges have been dropped and their investigations are ongoing, though they have now given the brothers permission to leave the country. They've also said it's a condition of the Tates' permission to travel that they return at a later date, thought to be at the end of March. Now, the Tates have made multiple requests to leave Romania in the past, all of which have been turned down until now. So, what's changed? Earlier this month, the administration of US President Donald Trump was reported to be pressuring Romania to lift its travel ban on the Tates. A few days later, Trump envoy Richard Grenell raised the Tates case with Romanian officials at a security conference in Munich. But Andrew Tate's links to the new Trump administration may run even deeper. The man pictured with Tate here is his former lawyer and publicist, Paul Ingrassia. Ingrassia has claimed credit for helping Tate break into the right-wing mainstream by getting him interviews with figures like Tucker Carlson. In July 2023, Ingrassia said this about Tate on social media. Andrew Tate is an extraordinary human being, not only in terms of sheer physical prowess, though he has that in spades, but perhaps even more impressively, he is sharp as a tack and has the willpower and spirit to match. He is the embodiment of the ancient ideal of excellence, to seek perfection of mind, body, and spirit. An ideal that is radically at odds with our grotesquely decadent society, which values security and mediocrity over human excellence among men. It is for this reason that he and his brother have become public enemies number 1 and 2 in the eyes of the Matrix, the deep state, and the satanic elite that attempt to systematically program and oppress all men from womb to tomb, a form of communism that not even Karl Marx in his wildest dreams could have imagined. Now, it sounds like someone might have a little crush. Gosh. Paul Ingrassia now works as the White House's intermediary to the Department of Homeland Security. Besides loving Tate, Ingrassia previously also appeared to love insurrection. In a 2020 blog post, Ingrassia called for Trump to impose martial law in order to stay in office after losing the presidential election. Other figures close to Trump, including Elon Musk, have also praised the Tates. Asked for comment, Romania Prime Minister denied that US pressure played any part in the Tate's sudden release. Andrew and Tristan Tate were arrested in December 2022 at their home near Bucharest and held on suspicion of human trafficking, rape, and forming an organized crime group. Initially held for 24 hours, the courts repeatedly extended their detention because of the risk they, quote, could leave Romania and settle in countries that do not allow extradition. In March 2023, the Tates were released from jail and placed under house arrest while police investigations continued. That went on until August 2023, when the brothers were released from house arrest but placed under judicial control, meaning they could not leave the country. Last August, Romanian authorities confirmed they had opened a new investigation into the Tates. This one was centered on allegations involving sex with a minor and trafficking underage persons. And Andrew Tate was again placed under house arrest. This was his reaction to that additional investigation.
This is a setup. It's absolutely disgusting. Fair play to that judge who saw through the and let us free. Hey, I'm not a human trafficker, clearly. If you human traffic someone, there is evidence. This is a setup, it's a stitch up. The 3 prosecutors at D-Call in my house, I said, why are you here? There's no case. They said, there's a case if we make one. This is a setup. All of it is.
Now, Romania isn't the only jurisdiction where the Tates are facing potential charges. The brothers are also wanted by UK authorities over allegations of sexual aggression involving 4 women and dating back to 2012. The UK has filed an extradition request, but a Romanian court ruled that proceedings in Romania must be concluded first. The 4 women involved in that UK case said this today. It is clear that he will now not face criminal prosecution for his alleged crimes in Romania. He will use it as an opportunity to harass further and intimidate witnesses and his accusers, and he will continue to spread his violent, misogynistic doctrine around the world. Matthew Jury is the lawyer for the 4 claimants in the UK case. He said this in response to Tate's flight to America. The news that pressure by the Trump administration has led to Andrew Tate and his brother Tristan being allowed to leave Romania by its authorities is equal parts disgusting and dismaying. There is clear evidence to support the allegations against Tate that he is one of the world's worst human traffickers and serial rapists. That the US government would choose to lobby for his release is absurd, but sadly, given its actions over the past month, perhaps unsurprising. Any suggestion that the Tates will now face any justice in Romania is fanciful. The UK authorities must take immediate steps to secure their extradition to the UK to face charges for the offences of human trafficking and rape they are alleged to have committed in this jurisdiction. Romania has embarrassed itself. The UK must not do the same. 10 Downing Street was aware this may happen more than a week ago. The fact that nothing seems to have been done to prevent it is concerning. One can only hope action will now be taken. Given that Keir Starmer is in the US today to meet with Donald Trump, perhaps his team may take the opportunity to raise this issue on behalf of the many British women who Tate is alleged to have raped and sexually assaulted, who may now be denied justice. So, will Keir Starmer stand up for British women and the criminal justice system he once led? This is what a Downing Street spokesperson had to say. This was a decision taken by the Romanian courts independently following due process, and their investigation remains in place. But more widely, the Prime Minister has been clear that human trafficking should be viewed as a global security threat similar to terrorism. I'm not going to hold my breath, therefore. That spokesperson refused to say whether Prime Minister Keir Starmer would raise the case with Donald Trump when they meet on Thursday. Helena, what do you make of the fact that a president has intervened in order to try and get essentially an influencer released from Romania in this way?
I think what this does is very instructive into 2 very large contradictions and hypocritical positions that a lot of the modern right take. The first one is that they have kind of tried to rebrand themselves as the protectors of women, right? You've heard this a lot in terms of the kind of politics we're seeing at the moment. Now, this has been very recently a big thing because they market themselves as protecting cisgender women from trans women a lot of the time. They say, oh, we want to keep men out of women's spaces. They want to, et cetera, et cetera. They have marketed themselves as being the people who are proudly standing up for women in this regard. And this, of course, is completely contradicted if they won't even get some of these cases to be seen to go to at least any form of decision before immediately jumping to the defense of the Tates. Of course, as always, everything is innocent until proven guilty. These are just allegations until they are proven in a court of law. But the fact that they are happy to get these people out of there regardless, to have them be shipped out of Romania against what was the initial wishes of the courts in Romania, only there to be pushed to do the opposite by Trump, shows you just how little they actually seem to care about these people who could potentially, right? They could potentially be incredibly dangerous if these allegations are proven true. And I think that their opinions on women are certainly very dangerous, regardless of whether the allegations in the criminal court cases turn out to be true. The fact that they will defend these people to the hilt, given the misogynistic positions that they take on these kind of issues, it seems to me that doesn't seem to be a very protecting of women position. And it's not just something that they'll do with regards to like the trans debate that I like to call it. This has been a long-term conservative position, especially in the United States, with regards to ethnic minorities as well. Remember in the Jim Crow South when it said, well, we can't have people sharing, black people sharing water fountains with white people, for example. Well, what was going to happen to the white women, right? They will weaponize the minority status of women as a way with which to demonize other minorities. And so there was never actually a position that is sincere in its desire to quote unquote protect women. It is this weaponization, and it shows you again just how empty that's always been. We've seen it recently too, with regards to the kind of the migration debate that we have at the moment, saying, oh well, looking at Die Linke performing well in Germany, so lots of comments saying, well, it's lots of women, lots of young women who support Die Linke. Well, they're not going to be happy when the migrant crime rate affects women in their communities. And I'm just like, well, this isn't necessarily particularly true, regardless. And on top of that, again, you cannot market yourself as being the true people who are out there to have the interests of women at heart when you are going to be so hypocritical in your defense of the misogynistic attitudes of the Tates, and also to a desire to not have them see justice again, whether or not these cases come for or against them, again, allegations at this stage. So that's one big kind of contradiction, big hypocrisy that you see from conservatives. A second one that you see is the conservative position that they purport to hold of being the political ideology that supports law and order. You hear this all the time from conservatives, and it's just not true. Because there's a famous book called Willock's Law, which states that conservatism consists of exactly one proposition to it, that there must be in-groups who the law protects but does not bind, alongside out-groups whom the law binds but does not protect. And this is what we're seeing right now, whether when it's the law, when it refers to the January 6th protesters or the insurrectionists, whether it comes to Andrew Tate, whether it comes to Trump himself, somebody who has had multiple of these kinds of accusations, who has broken the law on multiple occasions, right? They were trying to point out this is a weaponized justice system. This is a sham case being used to smear people when it's their political allies. It's when there's political opponents that doesn't do the same thing at all. Yet again, they will have endless supply of benefit of the doubt when it comes to Andrew Tate, again, given his opinions, even notwithstanding the potential outcome of these court cases, they don't even want to see these people face justice, potentially, if these things have proven to be true. And this does not seem like law and order to me. That seems to me like what you really care about is the order part of that, to which you believe that law is the ends that justify the means, rather than a means within itself.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's such an important point that you make about the sleight of hand that this kind of the new right do around protecting women, protecting, minors, etc. We don't even have to look at the accusations that have been leveled, the legal accusations that have been leveled against Andrew Tate. We can look at literally the stuff that he says. I've got it, here. We can see saying that he's said to himself that he said that he absolutely is a misogynist. He said, I'm a realist, and when you're a realist, you're sexist. There's no way you can be rooted in reality and not be sexist. He describes women as intrinsically lazy, says there's no such thing as an independent female. And then you hear then he says that, women should bear responsibility for being sexually assaulted. There's a text seen by BBC Panorama where he apparently wrote to one woman, I love raping you. I mean, these are the defenders of women. These are the defenders of minors. And that's before we even get to the actual legal accusations that are being leveled against him. That's just the stuff that's come out of his own mouth, And this is the person and this is the kind of part of the ecosystem that is trying to say that, the right needs to be in power because they are the defenders of women and minors against Muslims, trans people, Black people, migrants, refugees. I mean, it's exactly, and it has a long historical tradition, as you mentioned there, Helena, this kind of, this white nationalism, this deeply right-wing, far-right ideology has often weaponized the perceived innocence of women and children, or sort of a particular kind of innocence of women and children, in order to bolster their arguments that essentially there should be violence against, other marginalized people. Now we have a little update for you before we go. So the press conference between US President Donald Trump and British Prime Minister Keir Starmer began over an hour later than expected. But when it did begin, it got off to a regal start.
It is my pleasure to bring from His Majesty the King, a letter. He sends his best wishes and his regards, of course, but he also asked me to bear this letter and bring it to you. So can I present the letter from the King to you?
Thank you very much. Am I supposed to read it right now?
Yeah, please do.
I will do.
I've got to tell him what your reaction is, so I need to know. I need to know.
He is a great gentleman, a great, great gentleman. Oh, that's well. Well, that is really nice. I must make sure his signature's on that. Otherwise, it's not quite as meaningful. It is, and that's quite a signature, isn't it? Beautiful. He's a beautiful man, a wonderful man, and we appreciate it. I've known him, gotten to know him very well, actually.
Yeah.
First term and now second term. Perhaps you'd like to say what that very important paragraph.
Yes, so this is a letter from His Majesty the King. It's an invitation for a second state visit. This is really special. This has never happened before. This is unprecedented. And I think that just symbolises the strength of the relationship between us. So this is a very special letter. I think the last state visit was a tremendous success.
It was.
His Majesty the King wants to make this even better than that. So this is truly historic.
I don't know why, I feel like men just fold in the presence of Trump. Maybe because I'm not a man, I don't really understand what this weird reverence for him is, but it's just so slimy. I mean, Helena, what did you make of that?
I mean, again, it's just, he seems to have, over the past however many months, just entirely gotten to this position where people will just show infinite deference to him. It's like, okay, well, I'm going to, again, parade myself around and try and be seen to be the strong man that I am. And people are just cowering in front of him, apart from Emmanuel Macron in that one moment the other day. Everyone seems to just essentially do what he wants. And admiring him for a second state visit, he wasn't particularly well received the first time. I don't expect that he'll be particularly well received, given that in his first term he was pretty impotent in terms of the broad scope of policy. And now the things that he's doing are, upending geopolitics in some ways that maybe there are some silver linings to, but in a lot of terrible ways, right? I don't think he's really going to be seen to be a welcomed figure when he comes for another state visit. But it's interesting, I think he was very glad to hear a letter from king to king in his own eyes, because that's what he sees himself as. I guess he is the head of state, but at the very least, Trump pictures himself as being like a monarch, despite the fact that his political base is those out of the Republicans, which is quite funny to me. But even so, I'm sure that's what he thinks that he's being done here. Again, it's all about the ego. It's all about the glazing. That's what drives Trump's political platform.
Yeah, and he believes he's the king in that real traditional divine right of kings, even down to the weird religiosity of the way that evangelical Christians in the US sort of literally do believe that Trump is sent by God to save us from whatever it is that we're all meant to be scared of today. I think it's worth saying, this is remarkably different from Trump's first term in office. And that is what, jokes aside, scares the living crap out of me. I mean, in Trump's first, term in office, there was a sense of a consensus that, it was okay to, there were diplomatic norms that had to be, aligned with. But actually, there was a broad sense that, we're not going to cower in general. I mean, Theresa May holding Trump's hand in the White House, notwithstanding, but generally amongst, the political media, amongst the opposition in the US, there was a kind of sense that there was an oppositional movement. A sense that with, particularly more liberal leaders around the world that, yes, we had to do business with the US, we have to do business with Trump, but an attempt to separate or distinguish themselves from some of the most extreme parts of Trump's agenda, that's gone now. I'm not sure why. I'm not sure why, like, we've moved from sort of from that kind of relationship to a relationship of just total deference and cowering. But it's really quite concerning. Anyway, on that note, someone who doesn't cower in the face of anything, thank you so much for joining me today, Helena.
It's been an absolute pleasure. It's good to be back and see you again.
And thank you everyone for tuning in. Make sure you come back tomorrow for another live show at 6 p.m. Until then, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.